Hi, I'm Bante Sujato, and I'm coming to you from the end of the world. Today I'd like to discuss another topic that I think is of some importance. Anyway, I think it's of some importance to me, and it's about something that I've heard around the place, and I guess you probably have as well. And the claim, essentially, that I want to critically examine is the claim whether capitalism is the cause of climate change, or at least is a major cause of climate change. And this is something that's often sort of, I think, fairly casually tossed around. And I think it's an interesting question because there are many problems with capitalism, but I'm not entirely convinced that fixing those problems is actually going to make any real measurable difference to climate change. And so this little discussion is going to reflect on some of the different aspects of this and perhaps point to a response that might be more effective, with the caveat, of course, that neither I nor anybody else has ever actually succeeded in stopping climate change, so there are no experts, merely speculative hypotheses. Okay, so the idea that capitalism is the cause or is a major contributor to climate change is, of course, a tempting idea. It's tempting because capitalism encourages material consumption, because it's based on the idea that greed is good, because it fuels people's desires and fuels people's expectation that a good world is a world in which their desires are catered for. And if we look around us, we can see everywhere the results of this in terms of excess, waste, meaningless production of material goods, and the apparent loss of a perspective that life is about something more than material goods. So this is certainly not an unreasonable assumption, and it's certainly not one that is, there's certainly something to it. It's also, I think, clearly true that in many cases, the organs of capitalism, by which I mean primarily the fossil fuel companies and the banks, as well as other organizations as well, but these are some of the biggest corporations that have ever existed. And they have worked very steadily and invested millions of dollars over many years to undermine the science of climate change and to undermine any meaningful action on climate change. So there's definitely a blame to be assigned there, and no doubt that capitalism has some role to play in that. Okay, let's begin though by defining a few terms and just making sure that we're really sort of talking about the same thing, because I think this is perhaps one of the areas where there is some problem or some confusion. When we talk about capitalism, what are we talking about? Well, essentially we're talking about an economic system. And we're talking about an economic system where the means of production are in private hands rather than in government hands. Private hands means the hands of individuals and also corporations. And it's usually opposed to socialism, which is a system where the means of production are held in state hands. Now, a moment's reflection, if we were to ask ourselves, where are there examples of countries that are purely capitalist or countries that are purely socialist, would show us that it's very difficult to actually find examples of this. In fact, there probably really aren't any, and never have been. Every society that we know, there is some role for the private sector and some role for the public sector. And what we're really talking about is a matter of degree, a matter of emphasis. We're talking about a set of values that inform decisions that are made as to what is appropriate to be used in one way or another. Now, in addition to economic systems, this problem is orthogonal to a problem of governmental systems, because ultimately it's the government that makes the laws that shape the form that the economy takes. Now, if we look around the world today, we can see that there are a lot of different kinds of governmental systems. We have examples like, the sort of classical example of a capitalist economy would be the United States. And the United States has a strong ethos of personal growth and individual rights for individuals, and tends to have a less emphasis on social responsibility. But of course that's not an absolute, and the United States government and the state apparatus is actually very strong, and there's a lot of regulation and control over economic activity of all kinds. It's far from being a sort of pure capitalist system, or perhaps libertarian would be the political system that would accompany that. What characterizes the United States perhaps is rather that it's sometimes been described as a plutonomy, that is to say a government by the rich for the rich. And so the purpose of the government apparatus is then to, in that kind of economy, the purpose of an apparatus is to entrench the privilege of those who already have money, to funnel money from the poor to the rich. And this has resulted in the generational rise in inequality, and the fact that the economic growth is almost all experienced by the people who already have money, whereas the people who have nothing grow in number and do not grow in money. So this is America. On contrast to there, you have typically like the social democracies of Northern Europe, for example, where you have a strong social net. You have much more of an emphasis on like the responsibility of the state to look after people, and you have a much greater degree of trust in the state to be able to operate in a way that's actually beneficial and useful for people, rather than this kind of quite almost nihilistic opposition to state interference. And I mean, for the record, full disclosure, I'm one of those fairly boring people, I guess, who thinks that on the whole, that model of government is probably the best one. But these things do vary from place to place. But I think that's pretty much as good as we get. Somewhere like Australia is kind of halfway between. We have a lot of the benefits that a social democracy have. We have universal health care. And reasonable social welfare safety net and so on. But at the same time, we indulge our predatory fossil fuel companies and various other things that make us more like the American model. But the governments in the world don't really sort of neatly fall on this kind of spectrum. You have plenty of places that run around the world that have quite different kind of models. And just to sort of mention a few more or less at random, you have something like, say, Russia, which is a autocratic kleptocracy masquerading as a democracy. You have China, which is a autocratic kleptocracy masquerading as a socialist country, or perhaps more kindly might describe it as an authoritarian state with a mixed economy. You have, say, Singapore, which is a sort of quasi-democracy, but really a benevolent dictatorship. You have Switzerland, which has its own kind of unique system. You have various kind of authoritarian states, like, say, a military authoritarian state like Thailand, and so on and so forth. So there's not one political system, and the relationship between those political systems and the places that they govern are quite different as well. Again, just to pick another random example, in India you have a democratic system, but it's much more localized, much more sort of state-based. Like the different states in India often have different languages and different policies, and often even federal elections are determined by local issues rather than national. That's changed in recent years, but that's still the case, and so that's why you can have, say, a communist government in Kerala, while the government as a whole is very far from being like that. So these differences between governmental systems are not nominal, and they have real effects on how economies function, and hence on how people in those economies undergo economic activity. And a good example here would be China. And I think that for many years, following the reformation of China in the late 80s and the 90s and the subsequent massive economic growth that we've seen there, I think that a lot of people in the West sort of had this almost kind of smirking assumption that China was just basically really capitulating to capitalism while sort of maintaining this kind of nominal communist government and really just being an authoritarian government. And recent years, I think, have shown that that's not actually really true, that the Chinese government maintains a control and manages their economy in ways that are quite different to what we see in liberal democracies. And that goes beyond things like censoring the internet, which, I mean, that's significant enough in and of itself. But it goes to things like a shaping of the economy to serve what is perceived to be China's national interests rather than what is perceived to be for profit, which would be the capitalist motive. So there again, my point here is really quite a simple one. It is that there are different governments around the world operating in different systems, and they run their different economies according to different motivations within those different systems. And that hopefully should be a fairly uncontroversial stance. But what it does is it problematizes the idea of capitalism. And if we have a look at those countries, I have in front of me now a graph of, or a list of, the CO2 emissions per capita in different countries. And it's a kind of interesting list. If we look at the top, a lot of the countries at the top are petrol microstates, oil microstates, which are probably not really representative, but Qatar, Montenegro, Kuwait, Trinidad and Tobago, United Arab Emirates, Oman, these are all the top ones. Then we have Canada. Canada's doing pretty badly. CO2 emissions 18.58 emissions per ton. CO2 tons of CO2 per person. Then Brunei, Luxembourg, Bahrain, Australia. Yay, Australia. Estonia. Why is Estonia up there? Gibraltar, Falkland Islands, then Saudi Arabia at about 16 tons. Then next Saudi Arabia, the United States. And of course, I didn't even mention Saudi Arabia earlier, but of course Saudi Arabia being a entirely different governmental system to any of the ones that I've mentioned before. United States, then Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, then South Korea, then Iceland, then Taiwan, then the Bahamas, then Russia, and so on and so forth. Then Czech, Bermuda, Japan, then the Netherlands, then Germany and Finland, Malaysia and Singapore. And on we go. So it's a rather kind of miscellaneous list, isn't it? And it doesn't seem to really correlate with kind of the degree of capitalism per se. I mean, generally speaking, if we were to try to compare like with like in the Anglosphere, Canada and Australia would be somewhat less capitalist than the United States, but our CO2 emissions are greater than the United States. So it's not at all obvious that there is really a one-to-one relationship between capitalism and carbon emissions. So why is this, or what's going on here? Well, of course, these things are complicated. There are many reasons for the positions of countries on here. And one of them is the possession of resources is a major thing, right? So those countries that have a lot of fossil fuels tend to be very high emitters. But, that's a somewhat kind of random factor. A much bigger, sort of more universal factor is simply economic growth, how much wealth there is in an economy. And generally speaking, the strongest correlation is between wealth and carbon emissions. So my fear really is that, we can blame capitalism all we like. We can legislate it. We can make rules to control what capitalists are going to do. But my fear is that it's not going to really actually work all that well. That we might end up just fiddling around the edges and not actually solving the real problem. And part of the reason for that is that when we do these things, when we try to correct capitalism, we do it according to the means that the capitalists have told us will work. For example, we put a price on carbon, and underlying that is this idea that somehow the market works, that if something's more expensive, that people will purchase less of it. I mean, obviously there's some truth to that, but it's far from being an absolute or straightforward truth. I mean, even in basic economic theory, then it's, accepted that this is just an assumption. In the real world, things are far more complicated. There are plenty of times when prices can be increased and consumption does not decrease. Sometimes you can raise the price and consumption might even increase. So there are plenty of factors that affect these things that are not directly to do with the economic factors. My personal preference would be to say rather than rely on the advice of the economists to tell us the way of dealing with climate change, we should instead close the minds. Once we've closed the minds, then let the economists figure out what to do. Our focus needs to be on the physical reality. It's a physical problem that we're faced with, how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. And our focus needs to be on that problem. Solve that problem by not mining the fossil fuels. But it seems that, and I believe that all of the kind of the mechanisms and the abstractions that we use are really kind of ultimately driven by this perception of a need to be nice and to not offend people. Because if we say just leave the fossil fuels in the ground, then the people who are making money from fossil fuels will be upset. Now, the argument that capitalism is the problem would then say, well, yes, you may well want to leave the fossil fuels in the ground, but you can't do that in a capitalist society because they have the money and they will therefore shape the politicians to their will, and they will block any legislation that will enable that to happen. And look, obviously, again, that's not untrue. I mean, that's obviously what is in fact happening. So it's not untrue to say that's the case. But it's not necessarily the case. I mean, there is legislation all over capitalist societies that restricts the behaviour of companies, often in ways that they really don't like. And all of the labor legislation, health and safety legislation, anti-corruption legislation, and so on and so forth. I mean, our societies are full of legislation that stops corporations from being evil, which is, of course, why they argue against that. They call it red tape and they try to get rid of it. One of the formative issues in my particular sort of political growth was the closing of the coal mines by Margaret Thatcher in the early 80s. So basically you have these sort of old, polluting and inefficient coal mines, which Margaret Thatcher, in the sort of first flush of neoliberal glory, decided that she would close. And being brutal and unconcerned with human lives, she basically just said, let's shut them down, and didn't really care about the people whose lives would be affected by that. The unions and the coal communities fought against this, and there was a battle for a while. I mean, to me, it was a curious issue, because on the one hand, I kind of loathed Margaret Thatcher and everything that she stood for, and on the other hand, it was completely obvious that she was right, that we did need to close these industries down. And it seemed to me, as it still seems today, that the right thing to do was to close them, but to do so compassionately and to take care of the communities, to retrain workers, to provide alternative means of education and employment, and to do what could be done to minimize the harm. Now, of course, that's not perfect, and it never will be. Not everybody can be retrained. Not everybody wants to be relocated. We hear many stories where these kinds of things have been done, and retraining and so on has been offered, and yet people haven't taken it up, and so on. And I'm sure that there will always be some costs when there are these kinds of changes, and we shouldn't ignore that or minimize that cost. But that doesn't mean that the change shouldn't take place. Now, Margaret Thatcher wasn't making this change for particularly environmental reasons, but she did make it. And so that does show that it's quite possible for capitalists to shut down coal mines and to focus on the physical reality that mine shouldn't be there, and that machinery should not be working, and those people should not be employed doing that job. So there's no intrinsic reason why capitalists shouldn't close coal mines. I mean, at the moment, that's not what we see, but that can change. There are plenty of perfectly good capitalist reasons why they might want to close coal mines. And there are in addition, plenty of mechanisms within a society that are not capitalist that enables the closing down of those coal mines. So someone who lives in Australia, I live in Australia is what is typically known or often known as a liberal democracy. So a liberal democracy is it's a form of government where a country is run by more or less by a majority, or a alliance of majority parties in some cases. And we have the idea of democracy rule, majority rule. But I think one of the things that's really important is that a liberal democracy is not reductive in its traditional form, and in the form in which it has been passed down and practiced. It's not a reductive or simplistic idea. It's not the tyranny of the majority. It doesn't mean if my mob gets 51% of the vote that we can just do anything we like. I mean, we have a constitution, we have institutions, we have laws. But more than that, we have a culture. and we have a feeling and we have a morality of responsibility. So a government in a liberal democracy is not supposed to just represent the people who elected them. It's supposed to represent all of the people, including those who voted for the other mob. So a liberal democracy is a more kind of subtle and more nuanced, a more multidimensional reality than simply the majority gets to do what it wants. And in recent years, the idea of a liberal democracy has been increasingly threatened and displaced by sort of the emerging model of what's called an illiberal democracy. It's a term that political scientists usually use. And for examples of illiberal democracies, Brazil, Philippines, many examples around the world. The United States is certainly taken a lot of strides in that direction. India being another one, and many different countries. So since 2006, I believe, the Global Democracy Index has been falling. And this is, I think, the most important and least reported and least understood phenomenon of our time. Since the end of World War II, democracy was fairly steadily growing and spreading across the world. And that reversed in around 2006. Why it reversed? Well, complex reasons. After 9/11, America's posture around the world became much more aggressive, and its ability to support democracy correspondingly diminished. Perhaps the internet played a role. Perhaps climate change played a role. Whatever the reasons we think. Oh, and obviously the resurgence of Islamic extremism played a role. But whatever the reasons for these things, the global indexes of democracy, generally speaking, show a reversal in the tendency around 2005, 2006, and since then a fairly steady but accelerating decline and collapse in democracy around the world. Until today, most of the people in the world live in countries that are substantially less democratic than they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And that includes, say, the United States, the Philippines, Brazil, Hungary, India, Thailand, Myanmar, on and on, China, Russia, on and on it goes. So these are countries that were either, previously authoritarian and have become more authoritarian, or which were democratic and have become authoritarian, like Thailand, or countries that were previously democracies and remain democracies, but whose democratic bona fides have declined, like, say, the United States. And we often hear sort of bandied around the place. People often talk about fascism and so on as being a sort of growing trend. And political scientists sort of have a problem with that, because fascism is a particular historical phenomenon with its own specific set of characteristics, notably that fascism is driven by a totalitarian ideology, whereas the illiberal democracies that we see today are much less ideologically driven. They're much less coherent. They're much more driven by charisma and populism and by underlying feelings of grievance and resentment, and the sort of bottled up, kind of inchoate anger at change and at the fact that the world somehow is different, and that sort of potential grievance erupts in, pretty much any direction. It doesn't have to have a specific aim or a specific goal. It'll just be directed at whatever the latest thing is. And if there is no latest thing, it will just be directed wherever it wants to. In the early 90s, it wasn't supposed to go this way, right? When the Soviet Union collapsed and it seems that the great conflict of the late 20th century, the competition between capitalism and communism, seemed to have been won by capitalists, and in the early 90s, it was possible to think that sort of Western-style liberal democracy was going to be the default position to which all humanity would evolve. In fact, there was kind of a rather notorious book published at that time in 1992 by Francis Fukuyama called The End of History and the Last Man. And this book was rather sort of heavily criticized at the time as being a sort of triumphalist text, saying we beat the others and now we win, so what we are is what the end of time will be. There's nothing better than what we're doing. And I should have to say that I haven't read the book myself. I'm just going on reviews and so on. But it brings up an interesting idea, because in recent times the book has been sort of reassessed, and one of the theses that he was really saying there was that not that there wouldn't be any problem or any not that the world would be perfect once this had happened. But what it was saying was that once we have outcompeted our supposed enemies, whether fascism, Nazism, communism, then all we have left is us. And supposing that that is the case, then we will become fat and lazy and complacent. And we will become, importantly, bored. And when we become bored, we will look for excitement. And so as a result of that, the enemy will be inside the house. We will become our own enemy. And a corrupt and lazy and decadent society will turn upon itself and will find enemies inside. And I think that we can agree that there's definitely something to that. We see a lack of sort of a focus on an external enemy, and rather a increasing division within the societies themselves. Increasing divisiveness along ideological, moral, and other lines. Now, of course, when that happens, then that cripples the capacity for a society to meaningfully respond to actual challenges like, say, climate change. And so what we are seeing in many countries around the world, and I think in Australia, in the United States, in England and many other places, is we're seeing a variety of conflicts emerging over whatever the issue of the day happens to be. And honestly, these things are vary from week to week. It might be cancel culture, it might be critical race theory, it might be anti-vax, it might be somebody attending a party without masks on, or somebody said something that uses language that they shouldn't have used, or whatever it might be. And we end up getting consumed by all of these kinds of issues, and they exacerbate that sense of alienation and distance that we all have from one another. And because of that, we find ourselves less and less able to make coherent and strategic long-term planning and to be able to cope with strategic and long-term issues like climate change. So I think it's worth taking a step back from that and then asking, well, is there another approach? I think one of the things that I've seen in my life, and as I've sort of grown older and, I don't know, either wiser or just more cynical, is I've become less and less transfixed by the idea of ideology. And, you know, when we're talking about capitalism or socialism and so on, we're talking about various ideologies. And the problem with ideologies is that they're always abstractions. And they are always massive and unreliable abstractions in vast quantity and array of data. And those kinds of abstractions can't ever really be meaningfully inferred from the data. They're just too far away from it. Rather, the abstractions are primarily informed by our own values. And then once we've made these abstractions based on our own values, we then get an attachment to them. And then when we get attached to them, we tend to see things in that way. When we see things in that way, we tend to perceive them in that way. When we perceive them in that way, we think about them in that way. When we think about them in that way, we reinforce our views about them in that way. When we reinforce our views about them in that way, we like it. We like it because it tells us that we were right all along. And so we tend to drift further and further into entrenched ideological positions. So one of the approaches that the Buddha recommended for getting around this problem is to see things in terms of processes rather than in terms of fixed entities. So rather than looking at the problems that we're facing as being capitalism versus socialism, take a step back and look and say, well, look, for all of the theoretical and, very meaningful practical problems with these different systems, the reality is that there are hundreds of countries in the world and that every day people go to work, every day people eat their meals, every day people go to sleep and watch telly and drink water and meet each other and laugh and play with teddy bears and get on with their life. And this happens in countries all around the world, and it happens in countries with all different kinds of political systems and economic systems. So the fact that political and economic systems have injustices and have horrors does not preclude the fact that they also can serve the needs of many of the people within those economies. And if they can serve those needs, then they can serve other needs as well. My point here again is I'm trying to make a simple point. I'm trying to make a simple point that dysfunctional as our economic and political systems are, they are also functional. They're functional in the sense that we turn on the electricity and it's there. They're functional in the sense that they work to some extent. Now, if we look at all of these systems and we ask, well, are they capitalist or are they socialist or whatever, the reality is that they are a mix. And all of these countries are a mix of state control and individual and private enterprise. They always have been and they always will be. So positing capitalism, socialism as opposing ideologies is kind of a fool's errand, really. It's something that you can sort of argue about on a theoretical level, but the theoretical abstractions are so divorced from the reality of people's lives, it's kind of meaningless. A much more meaningful question is, in this particular case, are we better off letting people do what they want, or is there a role for state interference and control in this particular case? Now, that's what liberal democracies do. I mean, the general assumption in a liberal democracy is people can do what they want and still until it starts to create harm. And when it starts to create harm, we'll bring in some legislation and we will enforce that legislation to try to stop that harm. I mean, that's generally the idea that's supposed to happen. And obviously it doesn't always work like that. There's plenty of things that are harmful that are not legislated, and there's plenty of times when things are legislated and they don't actually prevent any harm, or maybe even create it. But that's how it's meant to work. And again, it's not totally dysfunctional. You know, the reality is that I can drive on a street in Australia and, you know, it's pretty safe. Most people keep the road rules and I can get around the place. And, you know, a functioning liberal democracy does actually function. So I'm pushing back here against the idea that these kind of systems are sort of absolute, and I'm pushing back against the idea that the recognition of the problems and injustices of these systems mean that, you know, they're sort of completely useless and the slate has to be wiped clean. That's usually more problematic than it's worth. Usually if you have a revolution, wipe the slate clean and build a new system, it's usually worse than the one that it replaced. So what actually happens in these systems is that we decide on a case-by-case basis whether it's a good idea to have some state control and what kind of control should be brought in. And that's more of a practical question. It's a question of balance. It's a question that people can have different opinions on, which are, you know, valid opinions. It's a question that should be influenced by empirical findings. You know, I mean, if you want to bring in some, say, safety legislation, right? You might say, well, on building sites, there's too many workers getting injured. Let's build in safety legislation. Then, you know, that should be guided by empirical studies. Does that safety legislation, in fact, lead to a more safe workplace, or is it just posturing for the sake of it? You know, and if we look at capitalism, and if we say, look, you know, capitalism is responsible for inequality, is responsible for materialism, it's responsible for climate change and all of these kinds of terrible things. Well, what are we actually saying? Because if we look around us, you know, in the area that I'm living in now, I'm in Harris Park in Western Sydney, and, you know, I see every day our local businesses, restaurants, grocery stores, mechanics, people fixing mobile phones, people running laundromats. I mean, these are all capitalist enterprises in a way. Are they sort of evil and bad? Are these kind of bad people? I mean, most of the people running these things, I'm guessing, or at least many of them, would vote for the Liberal Party, which is the right-wing party in Australia. I mean, we have our local representative is a popular Liberal Party person at the moment. So does that mean they're kind of pro-capitalism and only care about themselves and don't care about the environment and all of those kinds of things? Well, I'm guessing it's probably a bit more complicated than that, right? To me, they don't seem like bad people. In fact, they seem like perfectly nice people. Of course, when we think about capitalism, we often don't, you know, that's one of the dimensions of sort of propaganda distortion. Right-wing parties tend to say that they are for the little guy and for small business and so on, whereas in fact they are all about taking money out of the hands of the poor and giving it to the rich. So I'm not kind of blind to that that kind of exercise of propaganda in that way. But again, it's one of these things. It's not entirely untrue. Right? It's not entirely untrue to say that a lot of the engine of capitalism is provided by small businesses, and a lot of the people even working in the larger businesses are perfectly good people who are just doing their job and are doing jobs that are perfectly worthwhile and valuable jobs. So again, if we're opposing capitalism, what exactly are we opposing? What exactly are the differences that we would like to make? And these are complex questions. And absolutely, would I like to see, more safety for workers? Would I like to see better wages for workers? Would I like to see better protections against sexual harassment? Absolutely. Do I think there are many areas where there should be a greater state involvement in economic activity? I absolutely do. And particularly, there should be a much greater state involvement in reducing the externalities of economic activity. In fact, I believe that a truly just economy, no matter how it is formed, but a truly just economy must take as its basis the elimination of all externalities, so that any economic activity, the cost of that activity is paid for by the people who are undertaking that activity, and is not paid for and is not externalized to the poor, it's not externalized to the environment, and it's not externalized to the future. So I've been kind of talking around the topic, but let me just sort of bring together a few threads here and sort of offer a few sort of summing up some things, some ideas. One of the points that I'm making is that we don't see like a strong correlation between a more capitalist society and carbon emissions per se. What we see is a strong correlation between the size of the economy and carbon emissions. The other thing being, of course, whether you're a fossil fuel producing nation. But as a general rule, the bigger the economy, the greater the CO2 emissions per capita. And then that led me to suggest that if we want to curb CO2 emissions, then using capitalist means is, I think, unlikely to be the most successful. Largely because it's the means that is proposed by the capitalists themselves. They think that economies should be run by using these kinds of means, because that's the kind of abstraction that they're used to dealing with. It would be probably worth adding a sidebar here that it would be a mistake to think that mainstream economists actually really care very much about climate change. There was a study done probably a couple of years ago now, a meta-study done of the top 10 economic journals in the world, and asked how much did they talk about climate change, and the result was a fraction of a % of the articles published in the top 10 economic journals actually discussed climate change. And of that fraction of a % at least one of the articles had been roundly debunked and wasn't actually true. So the amount of true or meaningful articles on climate that deal substantially with climate change from an economic point of view in mainstream economics is vanishingly small. So when we look at that, then it should raise us a question about how much sincerity there is in all of these kinds of ideas, emissions controls. And, we've seen things like the carbon offsets, and we know that carbon offsets are largely a furphy. They don't actually work. They don't reduce CO2 emissions. The biggest carbon offset program in the world was in California, and it was shown to be actually make really no difference at all. New South Wales has had similar problems. Another big furphy was plastic recycling, and so we were told that recycle plastics and that will solve our problem. Well, no, it doesn't. Plastics don't get recycled, and to a large extent can't really be recycled. And this is just a cover for fossil fuel companies to keep making these things. So if we let this, this is what's going to happen if we let the manner of making changes go into the hands of the economists, then they are going to leave the same kinds of loopholes around things that there are for everything else. And we're going to see the same when you have these are all leaky abstractions. It's all based on It's all based on theories and ideas and ideologies about how the world works that are very difficult to apply to actual physical realities. Even a concept like CO2 emissions is an abstract concept. How do we calculate that? It's extremely hard to calculate CO2 emissions. A recent study showed that there are error rates of at least 20% on average globally for the emission side. I mean, we're relying on companies and governments to cite figures accurately and reliably, and spoiler alert, they don't. So again, we are putting into place these systems built on these economic abstractions that are highly leaky and highly subject to all the usual kinds of shenanigans, the kinds of shenanigans that we know that governments and corporations do all the time. I mean, we can keep on citing examples of these things. I mean, not long ago, Mercedes-Benz was found lying about their emissions from their vehicles, just as Volkswagen did a few years ago. There's another case, like a major case in Australia, which has received, as far as I can see, almost very little attention in the mainstream press. There was a couple of articles in The Guardian about it, which is why I learned about it. Essentially, in Australia, our CO2 emissions reductions since 2006, according to our government, has, I think it's like 20% reduction or something like that. And that's about half of what comparable nations have achieved. But this is what's being touted by the government. In fact, they're touting it for the upcoming election. But the study from the University of Queensland shows that this is, in fact, entirely non-existent. The supposed emissions reductions come from calculations of land use in Queensland and deforestation rates in Queensland. But there are two sets of data on those deforestation rates. There's a less accurate set of data, which is used by the federal government, and there's a more accurate set of data used by the Queensland state government. And if we use the more accurate set of data, then all of those emissions reductions vanish. It's just gone. It didn't happen. And again, this is not unusual. This is normal. This is what happens when you build a series of leaky abstractions and then rely on perverse incentives of the people who stand to gain being responsible for implementing those abstractions. That this is what we can expect to happen. And so my fear is that if we tie reforming climate change to reforming capitalism, practically speaking, what's going to happen? Well, practically speaking, we're going to fight a lot of elections to be able to even implement policies. Then we're going to have to put a lot of effort to develop those policies, to get people to like them, to get them passed through Parliament, none of which are certain. And, you know, in almost every case, the policies that will be passed will be watered down and emaciated and will not achieve their objective. And even when the policies are implemented, to the extent that they will actually do anything about carbon emissions and about climate change is dubious. Again, one of the reasons for this is, again, it partly comes back to the nature of a capitalist economy. Like, I'm not sure if I can express this very clearly. Basically, when you squeeze one area, it pops up in another. So once you've told people the basic ideology is that you don't have to care about others, that greed is good, that if everybody in our society only acted from their own self-interest, then society as a whole would be better. Then when people are kind of made to act in a way that benefits the we rather than the I, they tend to look for other options. They tend to sneak around the outside rather than sort of buckling down and saying, okay, well, this is our reality. We have to do this because it's for the benefit of everybody. Great example of that is the recent upsurge in crypto and all things related to crypto. And I did a long talk about that some time ago, and since then there's been so many examples of billion-dollar frauds and all of these things that's happened in that area. But this is what's happening in that area of crypto. Is it's essentially the moral foregrounding of the idea that a clever person outwits the system. That if you can get in on the ground floor, you are the one who is sneaky and clever, and is rewarded for your sneakiness and cleverness by making money without having to do any work. And this is the moral basis of crypto and related technologies. So obviously this has a cost, right? And it has a huge cost in terms of CO2 emissions. And that cost was not accounted by the IPCC because the industry didn't exist then. And this is just one example, but this is how things will keep on going. If we legislate and control one area, then to some extent that will work. But also, once we have enabled that system, that economic system that rewards selfishness, then the movement will be away from that area to find something else, and that something else will usually be worse. Crypto takes all the worst aspects of predatory capitalism from the 1980s and 90s, and then makes it even worse, puts it in the hands of unaccountable, just anyone who can just roll out this kind of bullshit technology and then claim to have some kind of something that does anything at all. And it's been around for 13 years and has achieved nothing. And yet we believe that it's going to be the future. Again, my argument here is that just as if we think about systems, the way that our economies work and our governments work, if we think about these things primarily through an ideological lens, we are going to lead to divisiveness, but more importantly, we are going to lead to a separation, a growing separation of our own understanding from the empirical reality of what's going on. We'll be blinded by our views. And so we should look at what people do, and we should look at things that are local and specific rather than things which are too overly determined by ideology. And in the same way, if we allow our ideological needs to be primarily disposing our responses to climate change and so on, we're going to be building those responses on top of leaky abstractions and likely to not achieve the kinds of goals that we want to. So my response in both of these kinds of areas is to say, let's back off on the ideology. I'm not saying that ideologies have no purpose, or views have a purpose, and perceptions have a purpose, but they are limited. They help us to clarify our ideas and so on, but we shouldn't ever mistake them for being things that actually exist and are real in the world. In the real world, there is irreducibly an I. I am here. I am Sujato, and I have a body, and this body made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. It's not too dissimilar to your body, and it is growing and changing, and it's been with me since I was born. And I have desires, and I have memories and beliefs and views and aspirations. And all of these are things that only I have and that I don't share with others. And these things that I have, and especially my desires, shape how I live my life. I want to live as a monk, and I'm grateful that I live in a society that allows me the freedom to live as a monk. I choose to not want material goods. And I haven't been shopping in I don't know how many years. I haven't used money. I don't want anything. Whenever I happen to go to a shopping center or something like that, I just look around and think, why would anyone want any of these things? And that's me, right? That's my personal feeling, my personal desire, my personal character. And that's something that's not shared with others. And so as a result of that, I've done a lot of things, and I've done, a lot of what I consider to be good things. I've made sort of central. I've translated Pali texts. I've written all these books. I've done lots of teachings. I've done my own practice and my own meditation. And I've done these things that have, I think, been a good thing to do and a good way to live a life. And similarly, people who operate in a capitalist system operate from a sense of I, and they have an I which says, I want to make money, I want to buy a house, I want to raise my family, I want to feel a sense of satisfaction in the work that I do, I want to have time after work to relax, I want to be able to go and play sports, I want to be able to watch telly, and so on and so forth. And so people have these individual and personal desires. That's how the world is. And it's good that there is a system that allows people to satisfy those individual desires. And if we adopt an extremist point of view and say, no, we should disregard individual desires and only look at social needs, then we've erected a system that doesn't relate to the world as it actually is. So it's good that there are these individual desires and that people can act out on them. And it's because of that people can do lots of really remarkable and interesting, curious, wonderful, and fascinating things. And that's where we get art, and we get different kinds of food that we can eat, and we get all of these kinds of things that make life fun and interesting. So we need to avoid demonizing human nature and human desires. But we also need to avoid putting this I on a pedestal and treating it as the be-all and end-all of the world. Because as well as an I, there's also a we. As well as a physical body that I have for myself, there's also a social body that I share with everybody else. And that social body is just as much of a reality. Margaret Thatcher, who I referred to above, famously said there's no such thing as society. Or at least that's what my memory tells me that she said. In those days we didn't have Google, so we couldn't check facts and stuff like that. So anyway, you should probably check that fact to see if she actually said that. But that social reality is irreducible. We have families, we have neighborhoods, we have friends, we have colleagues, we have nations, we have networks, financial networks. We have all these different kinds of connections with different kinds of people that are as much a part of our life as the I is. And we build the state as a way to help to manage that, and our state, our government says things like, our people should not live in an environment where the air is too polluted. Let's bring in some regulation to stop that because everybody breathes the air. Our state says things like, let's not drive too fast on the roads because when people drive fast, too many people die. So let's put a reasonable speed limit on the roads and enforce that. Our state says things like, let's have a defense force because if somebody wants to invade our country, we should be able to do something to stop them. And our state has a social welfare system and says if somebody has no job and has no money, then let's give them something basic so that they can survive and can get by. So these are some of the things that the state does as a we, where we say, okay, let's look after each other. And that's as much of an irreducible reality as the reality of an I is. And every state and every people needs to have that sense of a we as well as the sense of an I. Now, of course, we can question and dispute, and we should question and dispute the particulars of these things, how they're done, what emphasis we're putting on them, how we balance social welfare and individual welfare. These are all genuine questions, and they're questions for which there are often not clear-cut answers, and they're questions that often can't be solely determined by ideology, but they have to take into account things like history, culture, personalities, practicalities, and all kinds of things that are simply not reducible to an ideological posture. So if the ideas of capitalism and socialism provide us with inadequate and leaky abstractions that don't let us deal directly with the world as it really is, then how do we deal with the world as it really is? Like, what is our alternative, especially when it comes to something like climate change? So, as I suggested earlier, the alternative is to shift our focus from economic policy to physical reality, and to say the goal of climate change movements and activism should be to close down the fossil fuel mines, and to leave the fossil fuels in the ground. And within our particular societies, our particular cultures and so on, then we need to start asking ourselves, what is it going to take to do that? How can we vote in a party that will bring in these policies? How can we persuade people that these things are good ideas? How can we focus on that physical reality of actually shutting the mines down? Because at the end of the day, regardless of whether you live in a socialist country, a democratic socialist country, a totalitarian country, an authoritarian country, a mixed economy, a capitalist economy, a plutonomy, or whatever kind of system that you live in, at the end of the day, that is a shared reality. We have to stop digging up fossil fuels. We have to stop burning fossil fuels. That's the bottom line. And our question needs to be, how do we do that as quickly as we possibly can? And the more we shut down the mines now, the more leeway we have later. So is capitalism the cause of climate change? Well, it's not the cause of climate change. It certainly encourages materialism. It encourages economic growth, and these things are major factors in the development of climate change. I think it's worth noting also that capitalism isn't nearly as effective at these things as it pretends to be, and as people often assume it is. Again, if we look at the list of the wealthiest countries in the world, you can see the wealthiest countries in the world don't always embrace sort of a United States like pro-capitalist system, and social democracies are very high in the list of the highest incomes in the world. And once again, there seem to be many factors that influence the standard of living, not just the degree of sort of freedom that there is within the economy for capitalists to do as they will. In fact, I would say that in Australia and countries like Australia and the United States, generally speaking, it's probably true to say that left-leaning governments have more prosperous economies than right-leaning governments. And I mean, this is my own ideological bias here, but to my mind, the reason for that is because both certainly in the last generation or so, then that both left-wing and supposedly left-wing and right-wing governments within our countries, and I'm thinking specifically within the Anglosphere countries here, both of them have been basically pro-capitalism. We're not talking about making any major ideological differences here, but the left-leaning governments tend to be more more widespread. Is that an appropriate concept? They're more like, it's not just about capitalism, but it's more about social welfare, more about civic welfare and so on. So there's more of a spread of value rather than just the economy. An acknowledgement that there are other things in addition to the economy that work, and that the reason why that is more effective economically is because it reflects the real world better, because in the real world the economy doesn't exist just in isolation, whereas the right-wing parties who tend to emphasize economic prosperity are in fact really what they're emphasizing is their own ability to take money from the poor and give it to the rich. The I and the we, both of them are there, both of them are real. Both of them need to be taken into consideration when we're making any policies about climate change and other things that really matter in the world. If we are to really make a difference, then I think that there are really kind of two things that I'd like to suggest. First thing, as I've already mentioned, is the focus on the physical reality of, rather than worrying too much about things like carbon offsets, carbon emissions, and all of these leaky abstractions, focus on closing down coal mines, closing down oil wells, focus on stopping deforestation, focus on doing all of the things that physically need to be done in order to prevent CO2 from growing, and let the economy sort that out. That's the job of the economy. The job of the economy is to say, well, then, now what? You know, we've got an economy which is based on coal exports. Well, let's stop exporting coal. Now what? And that's the role where the economy needs to step in and say, well, look, we can transition in this way and that way, and guided by state policy and by popular decisions, then we can start to make the changes that need to be to transition to a post-fossil fuel economy. So this is one aspect I think that needs to be done. But the other aspect, which I haven't focused on so much in this talk, is the thing which is really underlying both capitalism and socialism or communism, and that is materialism. And I mean, let's not forget that the aim of Marxism and the aim of communism was always to produce material welfare for the people. It just wasn't so good at it. And extreme socialism wasn't very good at creating economic wealth. And to which I should add really sort of a caveat that I don't think extreme capitalism is also good at that. I think that, and this is what I was kind of alluding to beforehand, I think that we can sometimes assume that since the Soviet Union wasn't successful at creating wealth for its citizens, therefore that left-leaning governments are not good for doing that. But that's, I think, a false assumption. I think it's more true to say that balanced and mixed systems are the most economically prosperous. And the ones that are less economically prosperous are the extreme ones driven overly by ideology or by personal greed. And there are plenty of examples on the right of governments led by autocrats and dictators where they have strip-mined the economy for their own benefit. So the problem here is not the problem of capitalism or socialism per se, but the problem of materialism and the elevation of material wealth to the primary purpose of life. And this is what leads to a collapse of meaning and a collapse of morality. This is how we end up with a society of decadent, bored, narcissistic, especially young men, which is what Fukuyama was warning against, and which is what we see with the emergence of crypto and the anti-vaxxers and the Proud Boys and all of these kinds of things. Bored, dissatisfied, but you're not really sure what to be dissatisfied at, so just lashing out at whatever the latest thing is, and just using the freedoms that you have to exert your perceived right to be nasty to other people because you can get away with it. This is this is really I think, the underlying problem. And we're not going to solve this problem simply by reforming capitalism. And again, please don't mistake me here. I'm not saying that we shouldn't reform capitalism. I'm 100% in favour of unions. I'm 100% in favour of raising minimum wages, ensuring good conditions for workers. I'm 100% in favour of much greater environmental restrictions for the operation of economies. I'm 100% in favour of much more progressive tax rates for the wealthy. I'm 100% in favour of breaking up huge monopolistic corporations and so on and so forth. And I think there are many things that we can and we should do to reform capitalism to make it work better. All I'm saying here is that we shouldn't assume that doing that is automatically going to solve climate change and that it's automatically going to solve the deeper problems, existential problems that arise when you have a society whose values are materialist and at the same time are materially satisfied. This is this bizarre paradox that we have. We have all the things we want, and we are still just greedy for more, and we will never be satisfied. And it's that is really, I think, the underlying issue we need to face. We need to be looking to a value, a meaning for life that is raised above the merely material. And we need to find, and of course, for myself, I find that through Buddhism, I find that through the Dhamma. And, I have a sense of value which is spiritual and which is related to my own inner practice of meditation, my own development of wholesome qualities, abandoning of unwholesome, performance of work to serve the community, and all of the things that I do. And I have found this sense of higher value that has motivated me to do these things in my life. So I know that these things can work. Now, I'm not going to assume, of course, that is going to be the same for everyone. Obviously, it's not. But there needs to be something. And I know that for me, the value of material things is almost, almost nothing really. I mean, it's not that I'm kind of beyond desire or anything like that. I mean, I still sort of admire a nice Toyota Land Cruiser when I'm walking down the road and I see a Land Cruiser. I'm like, oh, that's nice, and well, it's a weakness, okay, but it's not the end of the world. Well, I mean, it is the end of the world, but it's not the end of the world because I have a weakness for Land Cruisers. So where is our higher sense of meaning? I mean, we have challenges. Obviously, climate change is a challenge. And there are many other environmental issues which are challenges. There are many social issues which are challenges. There are plenty of things that we can do as human beings that are going to be meaningful. Even if we look apart from sort of more obviously sort of charitable enterprises like that, even if you look at something like, say, innovation being a property that capitalists often claim for themselves, but the reality is that most of the major innovations that we rely on today, like the internet and so on, were sponsored largely by governments. And the state has a major role to play, especially in deep and long-term innovation. And what we've seen, I think, in the last 10, 20 years is the rather rapid collapse of innovation. And we have become so transfixed with the innovations of the previous generation that it's easy to sort of not notice that the technologies that we're using today are really just polished up versions of the technologies that were developed in the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s and 90s. And where is the innovation? You know, where are the things that are actually changing things for the better, and where the innovation is happening is diverted to kind of meaningless rubbish like crypto and NFTs and all of this kinds of nonsense. So I think that there are areas and there are things for people to do that are meaningful. They might be spiritual things, that they don't have to be spiritual things, but they are things that do have to be informed by a value that is not just how can I make lots of money while doing not very much. It has to be informed by a value of how to live a meaningful life, how to evolve, how to be a better person. Can we solve this? Can we do it? I don't know. I mean, I called my monastery the monastery at the end of the world for a reason. So I tend to be a bit pessimistic. I think that we can do this. So let me rephrase that. I am sure that we can. I have no doubt whatsoever that as humanity that we can evolve, that we can change, that we can find a higher sense of value and a purpose. And I know this because I've found a higher purpose and because I'm not that different to everybody else. I'm not a different species. I'm pretty much the same as everyone else. I just have evolved and changed my desires and my interests in a different kind of way, that's all. It's just conditions. There's nothing particularly special about it. So I don't have any doubt that we can live in a way that is more materially simpler and which finds purpose in things that are higher than just the material. The problem is not that this is impossible. The problem is that it takes time and that it's a long and slow evolution and it can't be pushed. And people are at very different stages in their evolutionary curve. And, you know, Buddhism has always assumed that people, even the worst of people, can be reformed and can be better. We have our own kind of evil is Devadatta, who is like the worst person possible. And yet even Devadatta, according to Buddhist traditions, is supposed to get enlightened. The catch is time. Yes, Devadatta gets enlightened, but it's countless years in the future. We don't have countless years, at least not as far as climate change is concerned. We have this year. We have today, in fact. And today, people are dying. Today, fires are burning. Today, CO2 is pouring in its millions of tons into the atmosphere. Today, these things are happening. So we don't have time. We don't have time till tomorrow. We don't have time till the day after tomorrow. We certainly don't have 10 years. We don't have 50 years to do something. The cost of climate change is happening right now. And so if we are going to really make a difference, we have to start closing these coal mines right now. We have to start closing the oil wells right now. We have to start closing the gas right now. And if we want to really make a difference, we have to look at the empirical reality. And the empirical reality says one very simple thing. Overwhelmingly, there is a positive correlation between the size of the economy and the size of CO2 emissions. If we want to reduce CO2 emissions, we have to shrink economies. We have to have less wealth. It really is as simple as that. There is no other proven, on a global scale, means for reducing CO2. There just isn't. There's no like the whole of our environmental movement is built on this assumption that we can decouple economic growth from CO2 emissions, and yet there just aren't any examples. We've been doing it for decades and it just hasn't worked. Yes, there are small, limited examples, but there's no sort of global, large-scale, mainstream examples of this actually happening. And yet there are. Our data says nothing but the opposite, that universally globally for a long time, what really matters is the size of the economy. So if we want to reduce CO2 emissions, we want to solve climate change, we have to reduce our economies. And obviously that doesn't mean taking money away from those who need it. It means taking money away from the rich. They're the ones who are creating this problem. Take the money away from the rich and just get rid of it. Just burn it. Have a bonfire. And and let our economy and guided by our state sort out what's happening. So anyway, so the topic of this little talk was about capitalism and climate change, and about whether capitalism as an ideology or a social and economic system can be ascribed to being really the cause of climate change. And my position on this is that, yes, there is some relation, obviously, between capitalism and climate change, but if we look globally, we can see that different political and economic systems globally have a similar levels of economic growth and similar levels of CO2 emissions. And there doesn't seem to be a strong correlation between capitalism per se and CO2 emissions. We can argue, of course, that those differences are on the surface and that underneath these countries are all sort of capitalist anyway. But that is making a dangerous distinction, because once you've said that's a no true Scotsman argument. It's not the case that all of these global economies are in fact run the same way and work in the same manner. They are meaningfully different. And if we're going to use the word capitalism in this kind of argument, we have to use it in a way that has some kind of meaning. We can't just ascribe it to anything that we don't like. So the real correlation appears to be not between capitalism and climate change, but between economic growth and climate change. And so if we want to solve climate change, we have to address, first of all, the underlying physical reality of closing down the coal mines, closing down the oil wells, closing down the gas wells, stopping deforestation, and the other major factors that are leading to the growth of CO2 in the environment. And we have to, at the same time, address the underlying problem, which is the problem of materialism and meaning, the idea that our lives are lived for the sake of physical and material prosperity. And so long as we live in that way, we are going to live our lives and aim our lives in a way that is going to be destroying the environment. And the paradox that we are really running into right now is not, I believe, simply the fact that capitalism cannot regulate the environment, because I think capitalism can regulate the environment. The problem that we're running into now is that we have got what we want, and that the triumph of the neoliberal model through affluent countries has led to a culture of decadence and boredom, which leads then to divisiveness and to a collapse of value and meaning and morality. And that then impedes any meaningful progress, because even the smallest and most obvious and rational things to be done are met with an unyielding wall of hate. So this is our real problem, I think. And whether we're living in a capitalist society, a democratic socialist society, a mixed economy, or even an authoritarian regime, at the end of the day, we need to find some kind of meaning and purpose for our own lives. It's not going to be supplied to us by the universe. It's not going to be supplied to us by what our parents have told us. It's not going to be supplied to us by our governments. It's something that we're going to have to find for ourselves. So how do we find meaning, and how do we find value, and how do we express this in a world where meaning and value are seemingly reduced to this common denominator? This is a question that I have found my answer to, and I hope that you can find your answer to this question as well. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening, and I hope that you've enjoyed this little discussion on is discussion a word? Discussion. Anyway, on capitalism, the economy, and the relationship between these things and climate change and meaning. And I wish you all the best. Be happy.